Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining the 2021 Summer Readiness Update Call. This is Christina Osborne with ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the meeting. The purpose of this call is to provide an update on the various summer readiness activities that are currently underway at the ISO. So we do have a few updates for you today. First, Delphine Ho is who is the Director of California Regulatory Affairs, will share highlights from the final root cause analysis report that was published on the Summer Readiness webpage last week. Then Greg Cook, who is the Executive Director of Market and Infrastructure Policy, will provide a brief overview of the scope and schedule for the Summer Readiness Initiative. And then finally, Neil Miller, who is Vice President of Infrastructure and Operations Planning, is going to discuss resource planning efforts. Also from the ISO on the speaker line, we have Mark Rossletter, Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at ISO. We have Anna McKenna, Interim Head of Market Policy and Performance. Joanne Serena, Executive Director of Customer Service and Stakeholder Affairs. Guillermo Batista Alderete, who is the Director of Market Analysis and Forecasting. And then also Ann Gonzalez, who is Senior Public Information Officer at the ISO. So what we'll do is we are going to go through the presentation first. I did post the presentation earlier today. It's out on the Summer Readiness webpage. You'll see it under Engagement Opportunities. So we'll go through the presentation and then we'll open it up for questions. And at that time, we'll provide you with instructions for how to raise your hand to enter the queue. We are recording the call and we will post the recording on the Summer Readiness page on our website. Look for that probably by the end of this week. Just as a reminder to please request permission from the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Delphine.
Great. Thank you, Christina. We can move on to the next slide, please. So on January 13th, 2021, the CAISO, CPC, and the CEC published the final root cause analysis, and that built upon the preliminary root cause, which was published back on October 6th, 2020. What we found is that, given some of the updates, that it didn't actually substantively change any of the earlier findings. What we mostly incorporated into the root cause, into the final root cause, was additional data analyses that weren't available when we were first publishing the preliminary analysis, and that was largely settlement quality meter data that became available after the fact. But having put all the puzzle pieces together, the final analysis does already confirm the preliminary findings, which was first, there was no single cause to the outages in mid-August. But that it was a confluence of three major factors. The first one being climate change-induced extreme heat wave. The CEC also provided some updated information about the temperature between August, as well as some additional information in September. And what they showed is that in August, it was actually a 1 in 30 weather event, and I think in September it was much higher. The Labor Day weekend was much higher at a 1 in 70. So that, again, reinforces our first factor of climate change-induced extreme heat wave that, most importantly impacted the entire western United States, or large portions of it, and that really exacerbated the demand for electricity and, of course, exacerbated our ability to get both RA and economic imports together. So that pointed to a high demand for electricity that exceeded our existing resource adequacy and planning targets. The second major factor, which again was already outlined in the preliminary finding, were that planning targets in our current transition to a reliable, clean, and affordable resource mix just really were not sufficient to provide enough resources to meet the demand in specifically the early evening hours on those hot days. And again, as a reminder, the two major events that occurred on August 14th and 15th did occur right around the net demand peak, just as we were losing large amounts of solar generation. And lastly, again, we didn't find anything different, that several practices in the energy market exacerbated the supply challenges that we saw under those highly stressed conditions. In between the preliminary root cause analysis and the final, the Department of Market Monitoring also came out with their assessment of the mid-August events, and they also had in their assessment that they didn't find any instances of market manipulation or withholding. So again, those practices that we saw in the energy market are going to be in various ways addressed, but there wasn't any single event that caused the outages, nor did we find necessarily any single generator or resource type that contributed to it. Christina, if you can move on to the next slide, please. So additional bits of information that we included in the final root cause was a discussion of the Labor Day weekend heat wave. So as I noted, the CEC provided some additional information about September, as well as information about some of the resource performance, in particular demand response. So that was stretched out into the Labor Day weekend, so we can include that. There was also additional analysis of resource performance by resource type, and as I mentioned, demand analysis, as well as looking at the customer meter settlement data with regard to bid and demand. Related to that was the scheduling and bidding of load in the day-ahead market, and we have that analysis broken down by different load-serving entities, both CPUC jurisdictional and non-CPUC jurisdictional. So that is in the report. As I mentioned earlier, the Department of Market Monitoring had already put out in November their assessment of the analysis from mid-August, and I believe they also included September. And so we do make references to DMM's analysis to be able to kind of close that loop. And then revise and updated recommendations. So there we took the core of the recommendations that we provided in the preliminary root cause analysis and updated it for current activities as well as we are here today, how we intend to update and inform stakeholders with regard to our progress. And with that, the CPUC has opened up an emergency rulemaking that they started last year. The CAISO is party to that proceeding, as well as you'll hear today, the CAISO has also started an expedited stakeholder process, and CPUC and others are participating in that. So we do have coverage there. So we provide some updates in the final root cause about additional activities that we've already started since the preliminary report, but also additional findings and next steps that we wanted to take after looking through the results of the final report. And I think that's it for me. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Stephanie. No problem. Okay, next we have Greg Cook. He's going to talk about the Summer Readiness Initiative.
Thanks, Christina. So good afternoon, everyone. So as you're aware, we have started a new initiative to look at market enhancements and process enhancements that we can have in place by this summer. We are running this through a fairly expedited stakeholder process, which I'll go over the schedule here in a minute. If you can go to the next slide, please. But we have, already identified a number of items that we'll be looking at through this process. The first one is looking at our export and load priorities. We held a workshop last Tuesday where we had a really good discussion on how the ISO, as well as other balancing authority areas in the West, prioritize their loads and exports. So we'll be using that information to help us formulate a straw proposal that we would hope looking to have in place by this summer. Next, we have our reliability demand response resource dispatch and real-time price impact. So this is, we've identified, and this was identified through the root cause analysis as well, that when we're dispatching some of the RDRR resources, it can have, it can impact our prices and have them tend to be lower than what we would necessarily expect them to be given the market conditions. So here, we're looking for enhancements that we can put in place so that when we do dispatch those RDRR resources, it does not mute those price signals during those tight supply conditions. The third one, we're looking at some requirements for storage resources during tight supply conditions. And primarily what we're looking at here are enhancements to ensure that we avoid charging during tight supply conditions, and also to ensure that these resources are available when necessary to meet some of our net peak loads. The fourth item we have is cost recovery provisions for hourly block imports during tight supply conditions. This was a proposal that was suggested through our roadmap process. However, as we look at this, I think, it's really what we're looking at here is having the correct import and export market incentives during tight supply conditions. What we're trying to address is issues where we could have differences in the hourhead scheduling process or hash prices and the 15-minute market prices, and where those differences could potentially disincent imports supply bids during tight supply conditions. We'll be looking at enhancements in that area. Fifth, we have short-term scarcity pricing enhancements, and really what we're focused on here is there a way that we can enhance some of our day-ahead market incentives to make sure that we're incenting efficient scheduling and bidding behavior, and in particular, making sure that we have incentives in place so that we get more accurate load schedules as well as virtual supply bids coming into the day-ahead market. Now, we're looking at, fairly limited provisions for scarcity pricing for this summer because we are looking at more comprehensive changes that we'll be considering in a new initiative that will be starting up later this year. And then finally, number 6 is EIM coordination and resource sufficiency test review. This again was an item that we discussed at a workshop last Wednesday, and here we're considering improvements for the resource sufficiency evaluation that we can have again in place by this coming summer. And then finally, number 7 is kind of a catch-all, any other items that we can identify through the stakeholder process, and I'll go into some of those now. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So we have already identified a few additional scope items. Those that I went through on that last slide were what we identified in the initial scope of the initiative, but since then we've also come up with a couple of additional items that we'll be looking at. The first is an independent study interconnection enhancements, and this is in an effort to provide additional capacity by the summer of 2021. Essentially what we're looking at here is provisions that would allow interconnection customers to add capacity on somewhat of an expedited basis so that we can award interim deliverability and the subsequent net qualifying capacity to those resources for this summer. The next item is considering enhancements to the resource adequacy availability incentive mechanism, which we like to call RAIN. We've had suggestions that we could look at applying this more often, not just during peak hours, but during some of the off-peak hours, like on weekends, things of that nature. Increasing the non-availability charges that we currently have in that design, and potentially limiting some of the exemptions. So we'll be looking into that, but I think here we do have to be careful because, again, these will be subject to what we can do from an implementation standpoint, and we'll also have to consider the potential contractual ramifications of changing some of these provisions as we're already into the resource adequacy operational year. And then finally, we're also looking to implement some of the provisions that we've been stakeholdering through the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Initiative prior to this summer, and in particular, some of the proposed planned outage substitution rules, as well as the minimum state of charge requirements for storage resources. We're looking to see if we can have those implemented by this summer as opposed to the current schedule, which would have those new provisions going in the fall of this year. And then finally, we're continuing to look at additional suggestions that are coming in some of the written comments that we received last Thursday. So next slide, we'll go over the schedule here real quickly. So again, the next coming up, we have the stakeholder comments are due on the workshops on Wednesday, and then we are on track to post our straw proposal by this Friday. And then we'll be holding a stakeholder call on that straw proposal the following week. And again, this is a fairly expedited stakeholder process. I won't go through all of these dates, but we're going to have to remain pretty tight to this schedule to ensure that we can be on track to make it to the EIM governing body meeting on March 10th, and then the ISO board meeting a couple weeks after that, which would then allow us to have time for the FERC regulatory process and get hopefully FERC approval so we can have the new provisions implemented by June 1st of this year. So That's all I had.
Great. Thank you, Greg. All right. Next, we have Neil going to provide an update on the 2021 resource planning. Emil?
Yes, thank you. There are really only two quick updates I wanted to provide. Both of these stem from changes we're proposing that we've built into testimony that was filed on January 11th into the CPUC's OIR related to electric reliability in California for the summer of 2021 in the event of extreme weather events. The two changes that we've proposed in that testimony is one, to seek a higher planning reserve margin to be applicable to CPUC jurisdictional entities for the summer. And the second, moving from 15% to 17.5%. And the second is to apply that planning reserve margin not only to the peak load period, but also to the critical hour that we see in the daily load cycle, which is when the solar output has dropped off close to zero, at or close to zero, but the load has remained relatively high. So those are the two changes that we're looking at through that process. The testimony also included a stack analysis demonstrating how the existing available resources would come close, but in some circumstances not quite meet that requirement. So that's where I would refer anyone for the detailed information itself, but I wanted to touch on those two key points. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Neil. So that's pretty much all we had for updates. So I think before I go over the resources slide, I'll go over that at the end. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions. So if you do have a question, press #2 to raise your hand. Just a reminder to please state your name and affiliation first. Also, if you can ask your questions verbally, that's, if you feel comfortable, it's a little more helpful if you have any follow-up questions rather than sending through the chat. But, if you feel more comfortable sending it via chat, that's fine too. So, Diana, let me know if anybody enters the queue, please.
We do have a couple of questions in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Leah Fisher with Public Generating Pool. My question is on the last presentation that we just heard from Mr. Miller, and just a question on seeking the higher PRM. I had thought that the proposal that CAISO was putting forth in that CPUC proceeding was to increase the PRM from 15% to 20%. But I think I heard just now on the call that the proposal was to move that higher to 17.5%. So I'm just wondering if perhaps I misunderstood or heard wrong. So if you could clarify on that point, that would be helpful.
No, yes, it's Neil here, and no, you didn't hear wrong. The short answer is yes, we initially provided comments proposing a 20% planning reserve margin. After more review of the forced outage information that we were using in building up what we considered to be the necessary planning reserve margin, we did consider that 17.5% was more appropriate. We were concerned that some of the forced outage information we were looking at had the potential to at times be overlapping certain outages and giving a slightly higher end of the range than what would be appropriate. So our proposal at this point that we've built into our testimony in January is 17.5%.
Thank you. Appreciate that clarification.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Mary Lynch with Constellation. On that same topic, I think, and Neil, I don't have them in front of me, but I think that in some comments that were submitted by various parties, a number of questions were asked about how the PRM applicable to the net peak load the net peak load hours would actually happen? Is it something that's done LSC by LSC? And because I don't have all the questions in front of me, but are those things that you're preparing to address with respect to the PRM proposal?
Those are details we will have to work out. We're only going so far into trying to develop what those would look like, depending on how this proposal is actually received. But we do recognize there are details we have to iron out about how it would be implemented.
Okay, and so what will determine when those details will be made available? Is it only after, does the CPUC have to adopt something first, or are you going to present those soon, or what will be the process for rolling those out?
Well, at this point, that's a detail I don't actually have available yet. We've been working our way through the CPUC process, and in fact, reply testimony on some of the issues that were raised there is only due today. From there, we're looking over these details and trying to land on a plan forward. We don't want to take it too far on assuming that everything we've applied for will automatically be approved. But we do need to get our own homework in order first about how we will be proposing to handle some of these details and then present that to industry. But I don't have the timing, I'm sorry.
Okay, and some of those issues, are they being addressed in the reply testimony, or is it still for later?
There are some issues dealt with in reply, but others will still need to be handled later.
Okay, thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Jerry Melcher with the Public Advocate Office. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Jerry.
Hi. So my curiosity is why does CAISO accept the projected demand methodology promoted by the CEC and the PUC when which is based on a 1 out of every 2 year forecast versus a starting point of 1 out of every 10 years, which is what WEC just reported in their recent forecast report.
This is Delphine here. I'll take a stab at that. So a couple years ago, we went through a process of trying to make sure that we were all coordinated because we all three of us have a hand in, various infrastructure and planning processes for either the CAISO footprint or for the state of California at large. So the idea was that we do want to create an alignment so that you wouldn't have to go and, look at one planning process at the PUC and then try to translate it to the CAISO, because at the end of the day, they all fit together. I think you bring up an important point. I think that's something that we would like to discuss and is being brought up specifically by us, at least at minimum, through the planning reserve margin at the CPUC. And if you read our, it was originally comments, but then it is switched over to testimony at the CPUC, we do specifically say that one of the percentage allowances that we have in the PRM that's explicitly addressed is that difference between a 1 and 2 and a 1 and 5. Now, granted, this is for summer 2021, so, there could be conversations after this period that look at years beyond this to say, well, maybe we should be looking at an even different demand basis still. So I don't think we've foreclosed that discussion, but at the minimum, I would say the last couple of years, we've tried very hard to make sure that our processes are aligned, and that part of that process alignment is to use the single forecast set that the CEC develops for the state of California. That's been a longstanding practice and something that we work pretty closely with them to ensure that we have that alignment so that we don't, get kind of twisted around when we're trying to talk between our various processes. So your point is well taken. I'm not saying that the conversation is done, but certainly we want to work with our state agency partners as much as possible.
Yeah,
it's Neil here. I would just tag on to what Delphine. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Neil.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I was just going to tag on to what Delphine mentioned was that, yes, the fact that, in laying out the testimony, we did clarify how we saw the buildup of the planning reserve margin reaching 17.5%. As Delphine mentioned, one factor was to deliberately set out how much of that margin we saw attributable to adjusting beyond a 1 and 2 load forecast. But I did want to acknowledge that that's a frequent topic of where people are there's some misunderstanding in suggesting that the cumulative effect of the load times the planning reserve margin is still only allowing for a 1 in 2 forecast. So that's something that isn't as clear as it needs to be, and that's something we will need to have to keep reinforcing.
But you know, reality is different than you know, this methodology provided. So how do we get reality aligned with, you know, what's going on? Because, you know, you're the ultimate arbiter of you know, the system. You have, you know, every avenue open to you because of NERC standards and WEC standards. And, you know, the econometric science is much more advanced than this 1 out of 2 methodology if it would be implemented correctly, so that you would be able to handle multiple heat days. I didn't see an artificial neural network forecast that actually does that kind of modeling being used. So I just think that there's a real disconnect between, you know, quote, you know, kumbaya processes and, you know, reality. Thank you very much.
I'll just add, Jared, you bring up good points, and you know, I would just note that we're sort of narrowly focused on summer 2021, but there are a lot of efforts and other processes. Part of it is on our side of the house under our enhancements to look at, you know, kind of validating monthly RA plans using the stochastic analysis. Similar discussions are happening under integrated resource planning process. So there are a lot of discussions around. I think what you're seeing, though, is probably a more narrow, streamlined discussion, simply because we're trying to get to something very quickly for summer 2021. But your point's well taken, so thank you.
Great, thank you, Mary. Diana, do we have anybody else in the queue?
Yes, ma'am. Moving on to the next question. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Steve Greenleaf with Brookfield. Quick question. I'm not sure if it's for Greg or Neil, but on that page 8, slide 8, the first bullet point on the independent study interconnection enhancements, and I'll profess I'm not sure of whether this is detailed in any of the previous documents, but could you expand a little bit on what you're thinking with respect to that issue?
Greg, it's Neil here. Would you like me to take the first cut?
Yeah, Neil, why don't you take that one?
Sure. Okay, so we are looking at basically 2 proposals there that are relatively innocuous, but we do think would help overall. The concern's been raised about the possibility of new resources that could either be expansions to facilities that might be able to come online by this summer. We recognize that obviously the ISO's 2-year cluster study process can't accommodate that type of quick capacity addition, but our independent study process can. In the event that any resources either are available or could become online by this summer, we also wanted to address the possibility of, if there was deliverability at that site available, allowing that site to have perhaps some interim deliverability, even if they still have to go through the full 2-year cluster study process to confirm the deliverability. Currently our tariff only allows interim deliverability to be provided once someone has completed that full cycle and waiting for resources to come on. Here we're looking at making a minor modification to allow that interim deliverability to be awarded if it's available. So we don't know if there will be many resources that can take advantage of this, but we want to create the opportunity in case there are. The other thing we're looking at doing is right now we do have a percentage limit on how much additional resource one is allowed to build behind the meter without increasing their export or their transfer capability onto the grid. We're looking at raising or eliminating that limit so that people could add more resources. It won't allow them to put more total capacity onto the system, but those additional resources could give them more energy capability over a longer period of time. So these are relatively minor changes that we think we can move through fairly quickly and would provide value to generators that are positioned to take advantage of that.
Thanks, Neil. That's really helpful. And did you guys detail that in your earlier issue paper or whatever you put out? I can't remember.
No, these are new ideas that we're adding to the mix.
Okay.
And we'll be bringing forward.
And that'll be in the straw proposal that'll potentially come out Friday?
Yes, there will be a narrative about these.
Yeah. Okay, great. And one last question. I know, so, Neil, I know you have certain criteria in the tariff for eligibility criteria for qualifying for the independent study process, and that's detailed. So I assume you're anticipating having to make tariff changes on that at FERC? Is that correct? Or do you think?
Sorry, the two items I mentioned both would be tariff changes, yes.
They would be, yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's helpful. That's all I have.
Moving on.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Imani from LEAP. I was wondering, will CAISO, as part of their root cause analysis, look into why so few PDRs were dispatched during a heat wave, even when you knew the system was constrained and likely headed into a stage 2 emergency? And if not, then why not?
This is Delphine here. I think these are several things that we'll be following up on, and we do make a note of that in listing of things to look into in the more detailed section about demand response. So it's not necessarily limited to PDRs. I think we'll look at it more globally. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Tyrone from PG&E. This is just one final question. I believe it might be for Neil, because you gave some great responses on the interconnection. My one question is, are you also looking to accelerate the ISP process as well as a part of for 2021?
Sorry, Tyrone. In terms of accelerating the process, the ISP process does move quite quickly as it is. If you thought there were components that we should be taking a second look at, perhaps you could reach out to me offline.
That's okay. Absolutely. Okay, great.
Okay.
All right. That's really helpful. Thanks, Neil.
There are currently no questions in the queue.
Okay, we do have a couple of chat questions. We have one. Will minimum SOC requirement for batteries apply only to those in RA plan? So, Greg, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take that. Yeah, the answer to that is yes. That's, we are including that. That's part of the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Initiative. These are all provisions that would only apply to RA resources.
Okay, Alva, if you have a follow-up, you can raise your hand or send it through the chat. And then they have a question, will the consideration of enhancing RAIN to include off-peak hours and increased charges for non-availability be in addition to changes to planned outage substitution rules or in place of?
Those would be in addition to. We're considering those separately. Again, we're going to have to be very judicious as to what changes we can make for RAIN. Again, as I mentioned earlier, because we're already within the RA operational year, as well as there's limited changes that we can do at this time because they can have big impacts to our settlement system. So those are things we're all going to have to take into account, but we are looking into those types of changes to the RAIN mechanism.
Thank you, Greg. And then we have one more in the chat. Can you detail further the plans / proposals for storage resources? So I don't know if this person meant in our straw proposal or Sergio.
Yeah.
Your question. No, go ahead, Greg.
Well, I was just going to say that, I think on this call, we're just trying to, clarify what we're looking at from the scope of what we can do. And, in particular, we're looking at market changes. And I think, primarily for the storage, you can be looking at the provisions that we have in the resource adequacy enhancements. That's, our primary focus. But then we're also looking at ensuring other areas such as when we have storage on regulation, other enhancements we may need to make to our AGC signal to make sure that, that's better aligned with our operational needs, those types of things. So I don't want to get into the exact proposals here because we will be outlining all of that in our proposal that we'll be posting on Friday.
Thank you. And then let's see. Couple more. The volume of CAISO-wide underscheduling on 8/14/15, page 61 of the final report, appears 29 to 52% lower than what was reported in the preliminary root cause analysis. Could you clarify the reasons behind those differences?
Sure, this is Delphine here. I don't have all of the numbers in front of me. I know part of the difference was, as we had already explained on a prior call after the preliminary root cause came out, was the accounting for losses. So there was a couple hundred megawatts difference because of that. But subsequent to that, the main difference would be because we finally got the settlement quality meter data for the bid and demand. So that could be attributed to the remainder of the causes. There might be one more item I'm missing in there, but that's what I recall off the top of my head. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Delphine. And we did receive another one in the chat. In the Summer Readiness Initiative, as they were not covered in the previous calls either, since MSOC would not enter into effect until fall 2021, what are the plans this year?
Yeah, this is Greg. So, as I pointed out, I think what we're looking at is whether we can move up that implementation to this summer. So that's our plan A, and we're looking into that. And if not, we'll be looking at whether there's other provisions that might be necessary. And we're also working on, several new operational tools that we can be using to help, have better visibility into the storage resources for this summer.
Thank you, Greg. So that's all for chat questions. Do we have anybody in the queue, Diana?
No, there are currently no questions in the queue.
Okay, just a reminder, if you guys have any questions, press pound 2 to raise your hand. I'll go ahead and go over this slide, and then we'll check again before we conclude the call. So this is just a slide with resources that are related to the summer readiness efforts. We do encourage stakeholders to visit the summer readiness webpage, linked on our the ISO's homepage. And we did publish the January report for the summer 2021, reliability. That was published on Friday. And if you do want to engage in the Summer Readiness Initiative, I've provided a link here. You can also find that by going out on the Stakeholder Initiatives webpage. We did create 2 new subject types in city. We have one for summer 2020 data request, and we also have created a subject for the final root cause analysis. So if you have any questions and you have access to city, you can submit those inquiries using those categories. If you do not have access to city, we did also include those subject types on our Contact Us form out on our website. So if you don't have access to city, but you do want to submit data requests for summer 2020 or have any questions about the final root cause analysis, you can do it using that form as well. If there are any members of the media, if you have any questions, please direct those directly to the ISOmedia@kaiso.com mailbox linked here. So are there any other questions in the queue, Diana?
There is one question in the queue.
Okay.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Sergio Dueñas with the California Energy Storage Alliance, CISA. I had a procedural question based on that last response I got to my chat question. So in the last couple of weeks, we've been having several meetings within the IRA Enhancements Initiative, and this minimum state of charge requirement proposal, we've been tracking pretty closely, and it's still under stakeholder development now, slated to be approved by fall. So based on this last response, it seems that you would try to apply it this summer. And I was wondering if that will be a formal move within the IRA Enhancements Initiative, if we should just be plugged into both, if there will be a backscaled version of that for this summer, or sort of what are the implementation plans? Since, I mean, it hasn't been very clearly communicated on that other venue that you'll try to have something in the next couple of months, basically.
Yeah, this is Greg. Thanks for that question. Yeah, to sort of clarify, we have been developing that minimum state of charge requirement through the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Initiative stakeholder process. We wanted to clarify here, we'll continue that policy development through that initiative. We did want to recognize it in this initiative because we are looking at potentially moving up the planned implementation of that new functionality from what's currently planned, as you mentioned, this fall. Then the implementation, we're looking to see if we can move that up to more of a June 1st implementation date. Both this initiative as well as the first phase of the resource adequacy enhancements elements, which includes that minimum state of charge requirement, have been scheduled to go to the ISO Board of Governors for a decision at the end of March. So both of these initiatives are on that same timeline. The only thing we would be potentially changing would be the proposed implementation date.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
All right, Diana, do we have anybody else in the queue?
There's one more question in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Elaine Ginocchio from the Western Interstate Energy Board. I have a question that relates back to, well, basically the whole initiative, but maybe page 7 of the slide deck. What is the approval process for this initiative in terms of the governing body and the CAISO board? Is the whole thing going through, I mean, some of these specifically like the EIM coordination is one that would probably be priority one for the EIM governing body. Is the whole thing going to go through both boards? Are you going to, you have 7 items here, specifically attach, how the priority for each item to the governing body? I mean, how's that going to work?
Hi, this is Greg. Yeah, we'll be going through each of these elements individually, and once we come up with the proposals for each of these elements, we'll look at how the EIM governing body authority rules would apply to them. I would imagine, as you mentioned, like obviously if we're making changes to the EIM resource sufficiency test, those will probably be, have primary authority for the EIM governing body where, there may be, like resource adequacy provisions where there may be no EIM impact on those, and then there's probably several that will also have advisory authority. But we're going to have to go through these one by one, and then when we get to the March time frame and we have our final proposals on each element, then we'll have, the various packages going to both the EIM governing body and the board, based on, how the EIM governing body authority rules apply to each of the elements of the proposal.
Great, that makes sense. I have a second question. So your annual roadmap or annual plan is pretty much toast right now. Well, it's outdated, let's put it that way at this point. Do you know when you're going to be revising it to reflect, so for example, you mentioned scarcity pricing. It's sort of going forward in terms of short-term goals in this summer impact initiative, but the real long-term or the real bulk of the scarcity pricing initiative will be taking place later in the year. So when are you going to be updating the annual plan to reflect sort of what's happening with initiatives on the map right now and where they're going to be now that you're prioritizing summer preparedness?
Tomorrow. Well, actually, we were able to pull the plan out of the toaster before it got totally toasted. So we will be, we have updated the plan to essentially recognize that we have this new initiative in place, which is going to, cause us to take a short hiatus on some of our other market design initiatives. So we have pushed those off, and those are, that new schedule has been depicted and updated in our roadmap slides, and it was actually updated in the slides that we presented to the board in late December, and it also will be, further updated in the slides that we're presenting to the EM governing body tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much.
You bet.
Okay, Diana, do we have any other questions?
Well, there are currently no questions in the queue.
All right. So again, we did record the call today. We'll make that recording as soon as we receive it from AT&T. We'll go ahead and post it on the Summer Readiness webpage that's linked on this slide. There you'll also find a presentation that we shared with all of you today. So if you, again, if you have any questions following this call, you can either submit them through Citi or you can also submit those through Contact Us. So thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate all the questions and your engagement in these processes, and enjoy the rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.